and David's going to come read for us.
1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 7. Let a man so account of us as of the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified, but he that judgeth me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, will make manifest the counsels of the hearts, and then shall every man have praise of God. And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that you might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, that no one of you be puffed up for one against another. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory, as if thou hadst not received it? Father, Christ is our foundation, and apart from him there is no salvation, only death. Though men pervert the word, the truth of Christ and his righteousness prevail. Be with Ken as he preaches the gospel. Amen.
Well, I've entitled this message, Who Makes Us to Differ? Just look around this room right now. Everybody's different, whether it's size, height, color, hair, eyes. That's the physical. But who made us to differ? And then you get down into the spiritual, where there are some that God has been pleased to reveal Christ in and others not. But who makes us to differ? Think even in the natural sense, our talents. I get to know most of you here. I know what you do. I know the work you do, and you wouldn't be doing it if you weren't good at it. And I've always said, if you're not happy in what you're doing, find something that will make you happy and then figure out a way to make some money doing it. But who makes you to differ even when it comes to talent that you have? Well, the answer is simply the Lord. And he's to get the glory in all things. And that's really what Paul is writing about here, because there was this bickering going on, even as he mentions again here that some said they were of Paul, and some of Apollos, and some of Peter, Cephas. And then the real spiritual ones said, we're of Christ. But he says, is Christ divided? Any knowledge that we have even of Christ, we dare not boast in that. We can't look out there in the world, and so often we get caught up criticizing religion, and almost as if somehow we have a little more intelligence than the rest of them. Say, well, they're all reading the Bible like we do, but who makes you to differ in that when you read the scriptures, you're seeing that it's all about Christ. Maybe you didn't always see them that way. I know I didn't, but I have nothing in which I can boast, even in any ability to preach, to stand and preach. That's not of me, that's of the Lord. And that's the subject here then that Paul is dealing with, and I would have us to consider, not just intellectually, but in our own hearts. If the Lord has taught us by his grace, who makes us to differ? Only the Lord. That's it. We have nothing with which to boast. And so here, there are three main points I want to bring out about this. First of all, Paul is dealing with who makes him to differ with regard to other ministers. Who makes the Lord's ministers to differ from others that are out in the world? There are many out there that call themselves ministers of Christ. They have those titles, and yet when you listen to them, there's a missing note. Someone told me one time it'd be like trying to play the piano without middle C. Pretty soon you're going to miss middle C because it's important. There's a reason it's called middle C. And as we listen to preachers, that's the first thing we listen for. What think ye of Christ? Or as we saw in a message recently, where's the Lamb? You can't preach this gospel of God without preaching the Lamb of God. So where is the Lamb? And you say, well, don't all these other preachers have the Word? Can't they read it? Well, unless the Lord opens their eyes, these scriptures here are nothing but paper and ink. And that's how they remain until the Lord's pleased to open your eyes and cause you to see that they pertain to Christ. Like Christ told the Pharisees, you search the scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life. And how many people are like that? They read the scriptures. I watch them when I go to a coffee shop somewhere. I sit down, people carrying their Bibles. They got their notebooks out. They're writing down devotional stuff. And I hear them talking with one another, well, what'd you get out of that verse? What would you get? And so they're sharing experience, but they can talk a long time and never speak of Christ. This is what I think. This is what I believe God's saying to me. It's all about me, me. Until it pleases the Lord to make a difference. And then what? It's all about Christ, who he is, why he came, what he accomplished, where he is now. If the Lord has given you those eyes, they're much better than these physical eyes. Because these physical eyes are going to wear out. But if he's ever given you eyes to see of Christ, that's forever. And oh, the joy of being able to read the scriptures and see him and learn of him. And we never stop learning. We never graduate from the school of Christ, by the way. It's continuing education by the Lord's grace. And so that's what Paul is describing here. What makes him to be different? What makes these others to be different as ministers versus others that don't know Christ? He says there, let a man so account of us as of what? The ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. So this is how Paul is coming back to those that were criticizing him and saying he wasn't an apostle and wasn't worthy to hear. He says here, let a man, or let those that wonder, so account of us as, there's two things here he says, as ministers of Christ, but then he also says as stewards of the mysteries of God. Those are important words, those two things. Let a man so consider us. Paul here is appealing that he and the other apostles, because he says us, so he's not just saying, well, I'm the only one preaching the gospel. I know that we're a rare breed in this generation, those of us that the Lord has raised up to preach Christ. And yet, none of us would dare say, well, we're the only one. You may have to search high and low to find one. But I believe that's why Paul said in Romans, blessed are the feet of those that bring the gospel. They're blessed because if there is one bringing the gospel, it's because God has made that difference. God has raised him up. But here he talks to these Corinthians who are questioning, and this was the problem, that they tended to look down on him and not respect his apostolic authority. And again, he was one born out of due season. He had plotted against the Lord, even possibly was part of the decree to crucify him as a senior member of that Sanhedrin. and even went out seeking those that claimed to be Christian and pursued them to prison, to death, all these things until the Lord stopped him. And it was there on that road to Damascus that the Lord, the resurrected Lord, because that was one of the qualifications of being an apostle, you had to have seen the Lord resurrected. Well, he did. And so that was his authority. But here he chooses carefully his words. He's not trying to get the Corinthians to look on him. I don't know of any preacher of Christ that wants people looking at them. But to consider, and this is what I would say to you now, my authority in preaching isn't just based on the fact of my education or talent or ability to speak. No, it's the Lord who has made the difference and set me apart not only as a servant of Christ, that's what the word minister is. It's the word deacon, actually, when Paul says, let a man so count us as the deacons of Christ. I think today in the way churches are organized, or congregations are organized, they think the deacons are the ones that count the money afterward and prepare the Lord's table. They do all the little menial tasks. But in Scripture, a deacon was a minister of Christ, one sent out to preach the gospel. And that's how Paul sees himself. No big titles, certainly not reverend. Perish the thought. I still get letters today. Reverend Ken Weimer, I just want to put across there, return to sender unknown at this address, because it's a horrible thing to somehow take to yourself what applies to Christ alone. He's the only one to be revered. And so Paul here is choosing his words prayerfully and carefully, I'm sure, not to exalt himself above measure, because that's easy to do, but at the same time not to humble himself too much to where people just run all over him. None of us likes to defend the ministry that the Lord has given us, but if you just lay down and like a mat let people run over you, then they will. So there's a balance there that the Lord gives to those that are his servants. Here he said, so consider us as ministers of Christ, as deacons of Christ, as servants of Christ. There are several different words in the New Testament that describe a servant. Here, Paul actually uses a word that describes a subordinate servant, and yet functioning as a free man. He does not use that more common New Testament word that maybe some of us have heard, like doulos. But here, it literally means to be an under-rower. And in that sense, someone is a rower in a big galley ship. Just imagine what was to row in that ship. And so, even though this may have been a lowly position to do so, yet how necessary. If you haven't got the under rower rowing, the ship goes nowhere. And so picture this, that as a servant or as a minister of Christ, the under rower is actually serving Christ, who's the master pilot. He's the captain of the ship. It's not our ship, and we're not the pilot. And he's certainly not the co-pilot, as you hear some say. But it is all part of the rowing, if you will, as Christ has appointed to bring that ship forward. And that's the gift when Christ ascended on high, that he said there he left gifts with men, some apostles, some prophets, some pastor teachers. But that's what we do. We serve the cause of Christ as his ministers. But secondly, here it says also stewards of the mysteries of God. What is a steward? Well, it's a manager of a household. So you can see the terms that are here. One's a servant, an under-rower, and the other is a servant in the household of his master. So in relation to the master of the house, the steward also was a slave. That was often the case. But in relation to the other slaves, that steward was a master. And this is the word that Paul uses of himself. The steward was the one appointed by the master of the household. He's not saying he's the master of the household. That's Christ. It's his church. We dare not call this Ken's church. God forbid. If it's not Christ's church, then we're in trouble. But the master householder, or the word used here, the steward, was accountable to regulate the matters concerning the family, provide food for the household. Guess what I'm doing right now? Providing food. Sheep's food. Christ, the bread. Christ, the water. That's our food. And seeing that it's served properly, it's not the presentation. You know, sometimes when you're having guests over, you get all concerned about the presentation, how it's going to look on the table, and you sit down and people put a lot of effort into making it all look nice. But you know what? If the food isn't served, you can sit there and stare all day long at the pretty plates and settings and everything, but where's the food? We used to sing that as little kids. Here we sit like birds in the wilderness, waiting to be fed. Well, that's important to me, that in preaching for you, that I serve you the one thing necessary, and that is Christ. Presentation might not always be there. Sometimes the Lord gives you an idea and you line up your outline, but that's not what this is about. It's Christ. Give me Christ or I die. And that's the steward. That's what he did. He made sure that the household was fed in proper times and proper seasons. That's why Paul told Timothy, preach the gospel in season and out of season. You ever fixed a real nice meal and sat down and the kids are going, I'm not hungry. And then you say, well, you're going to eat anyway. Well, you know what they need. And so, in season, out of season, there's times when we all have different appetites. I'm sure that's true today. Maybe in your heart you would love to have a greater appetite for Christ, but right now, other things seem to be weighing on your mind. And so it's not quite like you would normally like. But it doesn't change our need, does it? And how we need to hear of him. And so this is what the steward did. He was the master of the household. To me, that's even more vital. When he says here, and stewards of the mysteries of God, the mysteries. We know the mystery of godliness is that God was made flesh. But related to that, the mysteries concerning Christ and his work and what he accomplished for our souls and our need and our sin and all of these things that weigh us down, to be able to know that the steward is there managing the household. That kind of helps you relax a little bit, doesn't it? You know, there's order. The order is that we need to hear of Christ. We know that we're going to be fed of Christ. And being a steward of the mysteries, that the Spirit himself is the teacher. I know I'm the spokesman as I preach for you right now, but if the Spirit's not taking this word and applying it to your heart and bringing it home to your heart, it's just going to be words that go right by you. Oh, how we need the Spirit of Christ. But that's what we are, stewards of the mysteries of God. And being a steward or the manager of the household, that's what he managed. That's what he dispensed. It's another way maybe of seeing that, in distributing the truth of God. Beginning with Christ and ending with Christ. Christ in every way. So whenever Paul would hear criticism about his style and manner, and that's really funny. Sometimes you'll slip up and make a mistake while you're preaching, and that's the one thing people remember. And so you have to ask them, was that all you got out of the message? What was said before or after? Paul would hear criticism of his style or manner. But then, as a steward, he would ask this question, and here we get back to, who makes you to differ? If I'm able even to present the mysteries of Christ in a way that any would hear and embrace, the question is, did I give that to you? Or did the Lord? Because if the Lord didn't give it to you, I'm just the messenger. We often say that. Don't kill the messenger. And believe me, the time it takes to prepare, to read, to study, ask the Lord to bless. Doesn't matter how many years I've been doing this. If it's not fresh from the master himself, because that's where the steward gets his food. He doesn't even own any of it. He goes into the treasure house and brings out those things new and old. That's the way Christ described the true scribes of the kingdom, the stewards of the kingdom. New and old. You go back to the Old Testament and you show how the new is in the old concealed, and then you come forward in the New Testament and you see how the old is in the new revealed. But if you were to ask me, and sometimes people do, where did you get that thought? Well, it's the Lord. That's all I have to say. It's the Lord. But here he says in verse 2 concerning stewards that it's required in stewards, and you could also say in servants, it's required that a man be found faithful. And when I see that word faithful, I like to read it full of faith, full of Christ. It's not even any faithfulness in the preacher. The Lord knows that my need is as great as anybody listening to me right now as a sinner. But it's required in servants or in stewards that they be found faithful. Isn't that one of the most important things of a manager of a household? I've talked to restaurant owners before, and they're there from the beginning all the way to the end of the day. And I've asked him, I said, well, don't you have a manager that can be there for you? And he said, find me a manager I can trust. Because as soon as I'm away, he said, things are going out the back door. That's not a faithful steward. And certainly any that profess to be servants of Christ, their one desire is not to take away in any way from the glory of Christ and what they're preaching or somehow draw the attention to themselves. No, they must be faithful or full of faith, full of Christ. There are plenty that are guns for hire out there. They're looking for, and you can see it on the internet, there's congregations that actually appeal to preachers to apply for positions, and they even put the income and salary out there and everything, health benefits, all these things. They're looking for people to come in. That's not a faithful steward that puts himself out for hire. But if the Lord raises them up, then they'll be faithful to Christ, faithful to his gospel. They'll not be seeking their own interest, but that of Christ alone. And a faithful steward is going to recognize that in reality, nothing that he has is his. This is not my congregation. This is not our church. It's the Lord's. And they're his sheep. That's one thing the Lord makes me mindful of whenever I prepare. And people take time to come and sit and listen. We're not here to entertain or to give you fancy sayings to try to make you feel better. If you're the Lord's sheep, then I know you're bleeding after him. And woe is me if you come and I don't feed you of Christ. That wouldn't be a good manager, would it? Wouldn't be faithful, full of faith, full of Christ. I like what one preacher said one time. He told me, he said, Ken, just pass the bread. Don't stand there describing it and all the elements that went into fixing it. Can you imagine you go to sit down to eat and the hostess is telling you, well, let me go through the recipe with you here and show you. No, just pass the bread. The hungry ones are going to take it off and eat it. You don't have to worry about even how big a chunk they take. Just pass the bread. And I believe that's what a faithful steward, servant of Christ, will do, because the Lord brings those that he will. But secondly, we see here the difference. You know, what makes us to differ? Well, who makes God's servants to differ with regard to their accountability between men and God? There's some preachers that preach as if they're accountable to men. And so they preach to their audience because they're afraid of saying something that somehow might get somebody upset, and the next thing you know, you're out the door. I've been in those situations. You cannot please men and be the servant of Christ. That's what Paul said. But here you can see in verses 3 to 5 how Paul addresses this. And it may sound like he's being a little cocky here, but he's just standing. You got to be a man and stand for something, as they say, or you fall for anything. Here he says, but with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. That's quite a statement, isn't it? Well, who gives men such conviction that they can stand and declare Christ in spite of what men think or say? Well, that's the Lord. Who makes you to differ with regard to how we preach and to whom we preach? Paul insists here that their low estimation of him really mattered little. But it is what God judges that is important. He said, he who judges me is what? The Lord. There in verse 4. And that's all I have to say. It's not that we don't learn from men. Some of our best critics are our enemies. And I say, if someone's getting upset at you, maybe you're being right where you need to be. Clear, plain. We've had over the years different ones that have spun around and run out that door, mad. You don't chase them. And at the same time, you don't lock the door behind them to think, well, they're gone. There's a reprobate. You never know. At least they heard something. I've always said that. If someone gets upset at you, they've heard something. I believe that's a whole lot better than sitting there and like a deer in a headlight look and eyes glazed over and never really moved or impressed about anything. And it may be that the Lord draw him back. That was certainly Paul's case, wasn't it? There wasn't anybody praying for him. He was hard on that trail after those that claimed to be Christ, ready with letters of authority to put him in prison. And bam, the Lord stopped him, turned him around. He thought he knew the Lord, but when the Lord met him on that path, what was his first question? Who are you, Lord? I know that was the case with me. I thought I knew the Lord, but when he laid me low, who is this Lord that somehow in blindness I have missed in all of Scripture? And so this was Paul's argument here, if you will. The fact that he judged little, esteemed little what men thought of him. And that's what it takes in preaching the gospel. I've had preachers tell me that. They say, well, I see what you're saying from the Scriptures, but if I preach that in my congregation, they'd have my hide. Well, give them your hide. Better to declare the truth and even burn at the stake if necessary than to wimp around and try to cower and cater to people. If you try to please everybody, you'll never please anybody, because everybody's going to pull you from right to left. But here Paul declares that, verse 5, therefore judge nothing before the time. People will criticize, but that's a good answer. When they find fault with what you say, just wait. Let's see how the Lord answers the matter until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness and will make manifest the counsels of the hearts. And then shall every man have praise of God. We may not fully understand how God will be pleased to use his word. Maybe right now it doesn't seem to have an effect. I've had to learn that. Can you imagine a farmer going out and sowing a seed and then next morning going out there and looking at the ground, wondering why it's not growing and why it's not pushing up, and kicking the soil and trying to get some action, make things happen? That's not what you do. You sow the seed. Some's going to fall on the wayside. Some's going to fall on hardened ground. Some's going to appear to have produced for a while, but when the sun rises and persecution comes, they're gone. But there is that soil that the Lord has prepared, which when the seed is sown, and I say when the Lord has prepared it, it'll grow. It'll produce. Look at yourself right now. If you're here rejoicing in this gospel, you didn't do that. And it wasn't the preacher that did it. It's God. So who makes you to differ? Who makes any to differ? That's the point there. It's the Lord. Each one's praise, as he says there, and then shall every man have praise of God. Each one's praise will come from God. That's how you know God's done a work, when the sinner is giving God the praise. Paul knew he had little praise from the Corinthian congregation, but that didn't concern him. Now, I admit, we're of the flesh. When people say things, words hurt. Sometimes you'll sit there and mull them for a while. Sometimes you'll have a sleepless night because of what people say. But ultimately, that's not what defines who is the Lord's. Let the praise be of God. And he knew that there was that day coming when his praise would come from God and not men. I don't believe he's talking about, when it says until the Lord come there in verse 5, that's talking about, well, we're all going to sort it out in heaven. I believe, just like we saw in 1 Corinthians 3, when he sends the fiery trial, he's talking about the Lord coming in like a refiner's fire, working through a congregation, taking away the wood, hay, and stubble. That's where ultimately all of this is revealed. Well, verses 6 and 7, the third area. Who makes you to differ? Who makes any of God's servants to differ from one another? in humility and union before the Lord. It's possible that the Lord have certain preachers that are his, but they don't necessarily get along. We all have different personalities. But as long as the difference is just that and not the gospel, I know people like to quickly go to that and they say, well, it's just a personality difference. I'll tell you, most of the time it isn't. It has to do with the gospel. There's different ones in the city here. I've had people ask me, well, don't you ever try to get along with some of the other preachers? When I first moved here, I was on a trail to find any other that might be in this city that I could identify with and have some fellowship with. I even went to their men's breakfasts in the morning. And they had their Bibles. They opened them up, and we ate our little breakfast and had our little time of prayer, and then we started discussing the scriptures. It didn't take long before, whoop, out came the truth. They didn't want any hard doctrine. They didn't want anything that pertained to Christ that might divide. Can't we just get along? Have you heard that before? No. Not where God has made a difference. But Paul uses himself here in verses 6 and 7. He said, "In these things, brethren, I have in figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that ye might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, that no one of you be puffed up for one against another." And then that's where he asks the question, who maketh thee to differ from another? We can sit and talk about this preacher, I like this preacher, I like that preacher, but if they're not preaching the gospel, you shouldn't like them. We had that here just a few weeks ago with someone that came, and they were telling me about this preacher and that preacher they liked, and I had to tell them they're not preaching the gospel. They were shocked. They're no longer here right now. Maybe the Lord will bring them back. I don't know. But you got to state the truth. Who maketh thee to differ? Here Paul uses himself and Apollos as examples to teach the Corinthians not to be arrogant or boastful. Rather than building up the preacher, how about praying for him? Because he's a man just like anybody. And the higher you lift them up, the farther they're going to fall. That's just the way it is. So that's why he said, "Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes." When he says I have figuratively transferred, in the first few verses of this chapter, Paul spoke of the apostles being servants and stewards. He doesn't mean this in a literal way, but in a figurative way. It's not like he's actually an under-rower in that sense. He doesn't have a ship that he's doing, but he speaks figuratively so that they would learn a more proper way to see them as apostles. But for this reason, that you might not think beyond what is written concerning any man. And so when people today evaluate a pastor or a minister, but they do it with unscriptural standards. See, that's how most people, when they say, well, I like our preacher. Well, what do you like about him? Well, you know, he's a nice man. When people get sick, he comes by and visits us. He's so comforting. He's a caregiver. You can say all those things about someone out there in the world. That's what a funeral home director is supposed to do. Make you feel better about the death of a loved one. But that doesn't mean they're the Lord's. But people judge them based on their humor or entertainment value. That's a big one right there. Boy, I love how he tells stories. Or his appearance, his skill, being able to promote their congregation, all of these things. But none of that defines or describes a servant of Christ. Our one purpose as a minister is that we might decrease and he might increase. If that's the end result, then God be praised. And that's certainly my desire. But here Paul really asks three questions, really to humble the proud. That's what these are about. When he says, who makes you to differ from another? And the first is who makes you to differ. That puffed up state of these Corinthians meant that there was what? A pride problem. Anybody not have a pride problem? How we need to be abased before the Lord. And though this pride was evident, how was the pride evident? In cliques. That's usually a problem in congregations. You get people together and then they get into the little cliques. This one's starting to talk about those over here and this over here and over there. Your eyes are on the wrong thing. I've been the subject of many a conversation for lunch, roast the preacher. And then someone will come back and tell you, you should have heard how they were talking about you over lunch. Well, why didn't you invite me at least to enjoy the meal with you? If you're going to talk about me, let's talk about it face to face. That's what Paul's addressing here, who makes you to differ. And then the second is, who makes you to differ from another? Is there really a difference between us that you can look at? If there is, it's because of what God has done. But I'm not going to pit myself against another preacher or try to imitate another preacher. I've had some young preachers write and tell me that. Can you send me your messages so I can learn to preach like you preach? That's not how you're going to learn. If the Lord doesn't teach you, you shouldn't be preaching. Go be a plumber. Go be a carpenter. Those are important works. You can do those and still glorify God. You don't need to be trying to preach. Testify of Christ where you are. But it's the Lord that makes the difference. And then the third is, what did you have that you did not receive? Isn't that an important question? If we know anything of Christ, we've received it of him. In fact, everything we have has come from God. So there's no reason even to be proud that it's the Lord alone that is the source of all of these. These questions should prompt in our heart that question: do I really give God all the glory in anything that I am? I pray so, because we have no other reason to live other than to give him the glory. All right, we're going to have to stop there. I pray the Lord will bless what we've heard.